Come now, and let us reason together, and consider the plausibility that evolution really is responsible for producing all life on Earth. Since we can't travel back in time, and since we don't have any eyewitness accounts, we have to imagine what must have happened based on what we observe happening in the world today. So let's think about the possibility that all life, humans, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, insects, invertebrates, and plants all came into existence by developing slowly from a common ancestor through a series of small, gradual, undirected, natural changes over a period of billions of years. In order to properly explore this idea, we'll need to suspend disbelief and concede that the beginning of all matter, otherwise known as the Big Bang, did in fact occur as described by modern science.
In the beginning, about 13.7 billion years ago, all the space and all the matter and all the energy of the known universe was contained in a volume less than 1/trillionth the size of the point of a pin. Conditions were so hot, the basic forces of nature that collectively described the universe were unified. For reasons unknown, this sub-pinpoint-sized cosmos began to expand. When the universe was a piping hot 10 to the 30th degrees and a youthful 10 to the minus 43 seconds old, before which all of our theories of matter and space break down and have no meaning. Black holes spontaneously formed, disappeared, and formed again out of the energy contained within the unified field. Under these extreme conditions, in what is admittedly speculative physics, the structure of space and time became severely curved as it gurgled into a spongy foam-like form. During this epoch, phenomena described by Einstein's general theory of relativity, the modern theory of gravity, and quantum mechanics, the description of matter in its smallest scales, were indistinguishable from one another. As the universe continued to expand and cool, gravity split from the other forces. Quickly thereafter, the strong nuclear force and the electro-weak force split from each other, which was accompanied by an enormous release of stored energy that induced a rapid 30 power of 10 increase in the size of the universe. The rapid expansion of the universe, known as the epoch of inflation, stretched and smoothed out the cosmic distribution of matter and energy.
As you can see, the forerunners of modern science admit that their theories are based on speculative science, explaining processes that happened for reasons unknown. In essence, they too are imagining evolution. They are simply creating an academic facade with scientific terminology and complicated-looking mathematical formulas in order to convince you to trust their professional conclusions. Of course, they must do this because ultimately they are trying to convince you to believe an idea that contradicts every aspect of common sense, that nothing ultimately led to the formation of everything.
But there's an amazing amount we can see in the universe, and one of the greatest discoveries and surprises in the last generation, if not the last century, is that the dominant energy of the universe resides in empty space, in nothing. You take a bit of space, get rid of all the particles, all the radiation, and everything, and we find that that space weighs something, and we don't understand why. The fact that we can observe that at the present time is remarkable, and it's one of the things that led us and led me to write the book, because in fact it made us realize that essentially you can get a universe from nothing without any supernatural shenanigans. That basically, by quantum mechanics and the laws of physics we understand in principle, an entire universe with 100 billion galaxies, each containing 100 billion stars, can come from nothing because its total energy could be zero. And therefore, you don't need to literally violate any laws of physics to create a universe. And no, we don't know that for certain. But even that possibility is amazing. And I find it worth celebrating, the fact that we can probe such things, and we shouldn't be afraid of a universe that maybe has no purpose, because we create our own purpose, and our own purpose adds more meaning to our lives. It means our brief moment in the sun matters because that's the only moment we have.
And at the risk of sounding completely moronic, I mean, if the amount of energy in the universe is constant, then how did we go from nothing to something?
Because in fact, if you add up all the energy in the universe, it looks like it's zero. There are positive contributions to energy from matter, but gravity, the attraction of gravity, has a negative contribution. And the amazing thing is the total energy of the universe looks like it could be zero. And in fact, if you ask what would be the characteristics of a universe that was created from nothing just by the known laws of physics, it would be precisely the characteristics of the universe we live in. Again, that doesn't prove it, but it makes it quite plausible.
Obviously, the Big Bang Theory has numerous intellectual flaws, particularly the fact that, from the outset, it goes against the law of conservation of energy, which states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only altered from one form to another. If there was once truly nothing, that would obviously include a complete lack of energy, and thus would render a sudden exponential expansion of matter impossible. Some evolutionary proponents, however, sidestep this issue by instead suggesting that the theorized expansion of the universe at the point of the Big Bang was merely part of a regularly occurring sequence of expansions and compressions. This revision seems to resolve the issue of their theory defying the laws of physics by having the required energy for the Big Bang already in existence. Of course, this explanation only creates a new problem in that by moving back the starting point of their evolutionary timeline, it effectively nullifies the Big Bang as being the process by which everything began. So in the end, they've still not provided a scientifically viable explanation for how their theory could account for the beginning of time, space, and matter. And one of the most prominent theoretical physicists of our time, Dr. Michio Kaku, was bold enough to admit to the magnitude of the problem facing the evolutionary view of cosmology when he said, "Usually in science, if we're off by a factor of 2 or a factor of 10, we call that horrible. We say, something's wrong with the theory, we're off by a factor of 10. However, in cosmology, we're off by a factor of 10 to the 120th power. That is 1 with 120 zeros after it. This is the largest mismatch between theory and experiment in the history of science." In spite of the many theoretical problems with the Big Bang Theory, and in an effort to make a more important point, we're going to play along for a moment and imagine that everything did occur as they suggest. We will imagine that after eons of time, the early Earth formed as a hot, molten rock that was subjected to millions of years of volcanic outgassing, collisions from ice-filled comets, and torrential rainfall, all of which led to the formation of the oceans and the proverbial primordial soup. Now let's imagine that by some extraordinarily rare coincidence, a few amino acids, minerals, or random naturally occurring chemicals became trapped in some sort of slime-coated bubble, thus forming a primitive cell. Keep in mind, the more we learn about cells, the more we discover that they are unimaginably sophisticated chemical factories. In fact, Nobel Prize-winning biochemist Linus Pauling was quoted as saying, "Just one living cell in the human body is more complex than New York City." The significance of that statement and the catastrophic implications it has on the plausibility of evolution cannot be overstated. There is nothing simple about any form of life. Every living thing exhibits an astonishing degree of intricate complexity. The more we understand this, the clearer it becomes that there are a great many more requirements for life than a few accidentally trapped chemicals. But we'll forget about all of that because right now, we're pretending. So we now have the very first single cell that formed by natural, undirected processes. The most important question that must immediately be answered when imagining this idea becomes, how long would we suspect this single happenstance cell to survive? After all, if this single primitive cell is responsible for having given rise to all life on Earth, it would stand to reason that the beginning processes for that gradual progression must have started during the lifespan of that first cell. On average, colon cells die after 4 days, while red blood cells can frequently live for over a year. So let's average that and imagine that this very first cell managed to somehow survive for 6 months. Granted, that seems overly generous considering it was a chemical accident. It will, however, help to illustrate the point that in order to give rise to all life on Earth, this brand new primitive cell has a lot to do in only 6 months' time. The first and most important task for this primordial cell is learning to perfectly and precisely reproduce itself. That is going to be incredibly difficult considering it doesn't have DNA yet, which of course contains all of the detailed chemical instructions needed to direct cellular reproduction. Perhaps an even more important issue to seriously consider is that if this first cell was truly a random event, why would the cell be driven to reproduce itself? What naturalistic force would cause an accidental amalgamation of random chemicals to form an exact replica of itself? Reproduction inherently implies purpose, which begs the question, why would this tiny little accidental blob have any purpose? Wouldn't it seem more likely that it would just float there, continuing to be a random consolidation of chemicals until its viscous little bubble-like shell bounced into another object and burst? But then again, we're pretending right now, so let's just ignore the philosophical quandary of purpose and move on. Now clearly, this first inadvertent cell will need to move about in order to direct its reproduction, and movement requires energy. Cellular biologists have discovered a great deal about the remarkably sophisticated structures known as mitochondria, which are the powerhouse of cells responsible for generating all the energy used in cellular functions. So already this first cell needs to develop a complex energy-producing process in order to move around and get to work creating an elegant informational system that will allow the cell to duplicate itself, all in 6 months and without purpose. But oddly enough, creating a non-existent energy system is going to require energy, and since we know energy cannot be created or destroyed, this little blob of protoplasm is also going to have to find a way to break the most basic law of physics. Either that, or it will need to discover a means by which it can design a system for reproduction by harnessing the tiny amount of kinetic energy generated by aimlessly floating around. And obviously, both of these unlikely options must be accomplished without purpose and by purely natural, undirected processes. But of course, we're still just pretending, so let's disregard these additional complications and just assume it figured out how to naturally generate energy in less than 6 months. So now that this little coincidental capsule has an energy production system, it needs to get going on that information-bearing molecule that will not only create instructions on how to reproduce itself, but will also have a process by which to read and understand the coded language that contains the information. In addition, this system must communicate those directions to the various cellular machines that will be involved in the replication. Incidentally, those other cellular machines that will be involved in the replication process don't actually exist yet, so now this information-based molecule that is being created will also need to generate instructions on how to build these necessary cellular bodies using only the current contents of the cell. We must remember, the more modern science continues to learn about the properties and functionality of DNA, the more intellectually dishonest it becomes to suggest this complicated molecule could have arisen by purely random naturalistic processes. In fact, Bill Gates once stated, "Human DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than anything we've ever created." DNA is nothing less than a 4-character language that communicates a staggering amount of very complex and precise information. This coded information contains the detailed instructions for the various proteins, amino acids, and other chemical compounds necessary to begin producing complex life. In addition, it also contains the directions on how to construct the numerous cellular machines that will build the individual proteins and assemble them together into all of the various sequence chains necessary to produce every kind of tissue, organ, and structure for every kind of life on Earth. To put this into perspective, we could compare it to the information contained in the computer code which directs the assembly line of an entire automobile manufacturing facility. Only that code would also need to include the directions on how to construct the actual factory building itself, the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, all of the complicated plumbing, the intricate electrical systems, as well as all of the complex automated robotic assembly machines. The code must also contain all of the specific information needed to produce the necessary materials to construct these various components. Also included in the code must be a set of instructions on how to design and assemble independent mechanisms that could repair and or replace any of the systems within the factory when they began malfunctioning. So essentially, this computer code would have to be so incredibly detailed and contain so much information that the entire automobile factory could literally build itself and then begin to assemble fully functioning automobiles. So this first little accidental cell must find a method by which it can generate an astronomical amount of information through purely natural processes. And to further complicate matters, we must acknowledge that there is absolutely no observable evidence to suggest that information or language have ever arose outside the influence of intelligence. That is to say, information and language are only ever the byproducts of an intelligent agent. Director of the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture, Dr. Stephen C. Meyer, discusses this crucial fact in the fascinating short film, The Information Enigma.
It's a much more forensic style of reasoning than your ordinary experimental bench science. You're reasoning from the clues that are left behind, from the evidence that we have before us, back to the probable or possible causes that might explain what produced life in the first place, or what produced animal life, or what produced those clues that lie before us. And I ended up doing my dissertation in Cambridge on the historical scientific method. And one of the things I discovered in the process of my research was that there was this distinctive method. It has a name, and that name is the method of multiple competing hypotheses, or the method of inferring to the best explanation.
But how do scientists studying biological history determine which explanation is actually best? Meyer found an answer again in the work of Darwin and his contemporary, the great geologist Charles Lyell, who argued that in explaining the past, the present is the key. Lyell insisted that we should seek explanations based on our knowledge of presently acting causes, or causes now in operation. All this led Meyer to ask a critical question.
What is the cause now in operation for the production of digital information? Because the crucial question in the origin of animal life and the origin of life itself is, where did the information come from? Information stored digitally in the DNA molecule. Where did that information come from that is necessary to build these new forms of life? And I realized that the answer to that question is intelligence. The cause now in operation, the cause of which we know from our uniform and repeated experience, another key idea from Lyell, that is capable of producing information, is intelligence. Whether we're looking at a hieroglyphic inscription, or a paragraph in a book, or a section of computer code, or even information embedded in a radio signal, whenever we see information, especially when we find information in a digital or typographic form, and we trace it back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. So the discovery that information is running the show in life, the discovery that there are these huge infusions of information in the history of life, such as the one that occurs in the Cambrian explosion, suggests that a designing intelligence has played a role in the history of life. And it also suggested to me that it was possible to formulate a scientific case for intelligent design, that is, a case for intelligent design based on the same scientific method of reasoning that Charles Darwin had used in The Origin of Species. And so if you want to say intelligent design isn't science, you would have to say that the Darwinian argument in The Origin of Species is also not science, but no one really wants to say that. He's not using an unscientific method, he's just using a different method of scientific reasoning, an historical method of scientific reasoning, and I use that exact same method in formulating the positive case for intelligent design in both Darwin's Doubt and in Signature in the Cell.
So clearly, we need only to imagine this evolutionary scenario for a brief moment before we encounter a vast assortment of insurmountable obstacles that make it absolutely impossible for life to have originated through any kind of evolutionary process. Well-known physicist Dr. Paul Davies inadvertently acknowledges these many problems when he said, "Nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organize themselves into the first living cell." Through the decades, evolutionary scientists have continued to inflate the amount of time they suggest would be necessary for their theory to become realistically plausible. Continuing to tack on millions of years does nothing, however, to address that the concept of evolution is flawed at its very foundation. From the very beginning of this supposed process, it refutes itself. The only timeline that matters in determining the plausibility of this theory is the lifespan of that very first supposed cell. And there is simply no evidence at all that would suggest that a single cell could form by coincidence and then somehow manage to accomplish all of the necessary functions that would lead it to duplicating itself even once, much less eventually leading to the development of all forms of life. If we want the details regarding how the world and all life came into existence, we need look no further than the historical eyewitness accounts recorded in Genesis chapter 1. The scriptures are a reliable testimony from the Creator himself, the only one who was actually present when all things began. The Bible has never been proven wrong and only continues to be proven accurate by literally every field of modern science. Dr. Clifford Wilson, formerly director of the Australian Institute of Archaeology, said, "I know of no finding in archaeology that's properly confirmed which is in opposition to the scriptures. The Bible is the most accurate history textbook the world has ever seen." Knowing this, we need not be ashamed when a vast majority of the world scoffs and mocks at our belief in the Bible. Instead, we can stand confidently on the authority of the Word of God as we recognize that our Father in heaven truly has revealed himself through what he has made.